we have talked about it forever. Dark Side of the Ring, one of the best TV shows out there on Vice TV. This week, their season 2 premiere. Season 1 was an absolute smash hit. Season 2 is no doubt going to be just like that. The premiere episode, talking about Chris Benoit murder-suicide. Joining us on the Vaqueros Cafe and Cantina hotline, he's one of the executive producers, and he is the writer for Dark Side of the Ring. Evan Husney. Follow him on Twitter at Evan Husney, and you can follow everything with Dark Side of the Ring at Dark Side of Ring on Twitter. Evan, how are you, man?
Good. I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for giving us some of your time. I want to kind of let's go to the series itself. What led to the birth of this series? Because this has been one of the biggest hits as far as wrestling programming goes. This has been one of the biggest hits in recent memory.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, it started with my friend Jason Eisner, who works on the show with me. We created this together. We've been friends for over 10 years, and we come from the film world, but we bonded together over our love of wrestling that extends like far back into our childhood. And so, life kind of took us to different places. He directed feature films, and I was working at Vice. I was just producing, web documentaries at Vice, and they were starting a TV channel. And we had just, like Jason and I had just kind of re-immersed ourselves in wrestling content. We were watching like shoot interviews like crazy and passing them around, and that's how we stumbled across the Bruiser Brody story. And that just was a huge eye opener for us, because it was like, wow, this is a wild, nuanced story with a lot of different elements here. And it felt really ripe for rediscovery, and it felt like something we could really, sink into. And the kind of idea for it was like, if we covered that story, and we took our inspiration, which was from this like seminal documentary film called The Thin Blue Line by Errol Morris, and we're like, what if we told like stories from the wrestling world, kind of in the stylish framework of The Thin Blue Line, and really elevated it to be something just beyond. And so, because we really hadn't seen wrestling get that kind of a treatment. So that was kind of the idea, and then we kind of embarked on it just thinking we would do one, just that we would do this Bruiser Brody documentary, and that would be it. And then, of course, we pitched it to the channel, and then they were like, well, do you have any other stories you could cover? And then we just kind of put it together, and like, yeah, wrestling isn't there are no shortage of fascinating stories in that world. So we just put it together, and we shot the Bruiser Brody thing as a pilot in 2017, and then a couple months later, after it was finished, we were off to the races doing season 1, and now we're here for season 2.
The Bruiser Brody episode was so fascinating, and I knew a lot. I had heard some of the stories, and ironically,
right,
that last year, so we are partners with the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in Wichita Falls, Texas, and we had Abdullah the Butcher there because he was getting inducted. And we talked about that. We talked about that episode about Bruiser Brody, and it was interesting to hear. I mean, he kind of repeated some of the same stuff that he'd said in the documentary, so it was kind of fascinating to watch that. Season 1 was absolutely just it was incredible with the Bruiser Brody documentary. Here in Texas, we hit home big time with the Von Erich episode as well as the Gino Hernandez episode. Yeah. Was there something that surprised you doing those season 1 episodes, something that came out that maybe you didn't expect to find out?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I would say there's two big ones. One was, I mean, it's definitely a nuanced one, but when we were doing the Montreal Screwjob episode, obviously a story that's been told many, many, many times before, but it was a story we wanted to highlight because we did engineer, this whole show to be accessible for people who aren't, major wrestling fans like us. And it is an important story in the history of wrestling. And it really helps non-wrestling fans understand how the business kind of works behind the scenes and what it means to be a champion and everything like that. So that's why we did it. But we weren't expecting, Jim Cornette, who's a regular on season 1 and 2. We didn't expect him to kind of use that as his opportunity to be like, all right, well, I was the person that pitched the actual spot the actual compromising position that Brett was put in, in order to get the title off of him. So that was his first time he had aired that out to the world, which was really cool. And I didn't know that when we flew all the way out there to interview him. So that was cool. The other one is a slightly bigger in scale, but just was the entire Gino Hernandez episode. We kind of went into that episode hoping that, there would be a story there, because we basically went into it just knowing the rumor and innuendo behind the way that he died. I mean, many people thought it was a drug overdose, but then some people thought it was a homicide. And so, and it's tough to go into like a documentary just based on a rumor, but that's kind of what we did. And then to our surprise, we just found that, wow, that story, the rabbit hole was much, much, much deeper than we had ever hoped. And every day in the office, it felt like, some new little detail was being discovered. It was a pretty exciting time.
I can agree with that, especially the Gino Hernandez one. I remember when he passed away, and then I've heard stories from a lot of the veterans that were there at the time, and I'll be honest, personally, I do think he was murdered. I think there's just too much there to think this was just a simple overdose. Talking with Evan Husney, the executive producer and writer for Dark Side of the Ring. Let me ask you this: do you have a favorite moment from season one? Mine personally, during the Von Erich episode, I had heard, I know all the stories about how all the boys died and everything, and I've seen just about every interview Kevin has done, and that was that episode. That was the first time I'd actually seen Kevin Von Erich actually break down in front of a camera talking about his brothers.
Right?
Was there something that spoke to you?
Well, that whole experience, the whole experience of being with Kevin, was actually my top moment from last season, because we actually didn't intend to do an episode on the Von Erichs originally. It's kind of hard to imagine now, because it's probably one of my favorite episodes that we've done. But the thing is that we're just going to talk to him for the Gino story. And then, it was like, well, he lives all the way out in Hawaii. Let's make the trip worthwhile, and maybe we should tell his story, even though it had been told so many times before. But we thought the way that we should do it is we should go out on his turf and, on his compound, and spend a really good amount of time with him, which we did. We spent about 2.5, 3 days with him. And it was amazing because he's so welcoming, so warm, such a great guy. And his family was amazing, and he was surrounded by them, and it was just a great, protective force around him, and just seeing him being one with nature and everything. It was a really overwhelming experience. And I felt like what really helped in terms of, Kevin, is we went pretty deep into everything. And it was just, I think the experience of being around his family. And literally, I had his son Marshall, sitting next to me during the interview, helping, with prompting Kevin on certain things, and then also, Marshall knew a lot about the story. He's definitely talked to his dad a lot about what's happened. And Marshall was kind of prompting me on some things that I might not even know. So that was really helpful. And I think just the dynamic of having a family kind of coming together to help Kevin and to help tell him the story, I think is what kind of made it just a little extra more, emotional than it would be otherwise.
You're absolutely right. Ross and Marshall, both just fantastic young men. I've had the opportunity to talk to them on several occasions, be with them at different shows, and it is so great. I'm so proud of them and what they do for their dad, and it's amazing watching them. Yeah. They were at a Major League Wrestling show up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and it was the two of them and Kevin. And to hear that crowd, you would have thought it was 1985 back in the Sportatorium. It was so fantastic.
That's so cool. That's so cool.
So let's
I love those guys.
I know they're fantastic. Let's go to the season 2 and the premiere episode. Chris Benoit. So many emotions that came back watching that, and the anger and the sadness and confusion and just everything. What was your biggest concern putting this episode by itself together with all the different stories and just the absolutely tragic way that this story turned out?
Well, for me, one of the things was, obviously when you have a show that explores these types of stories in this world, you know, it's hard to ignore the Chris Benoit story. Being that it was just it was so majorly covered. And so it was something always in the back of our minds that we wanted to explore for season 1, but I'm so glad we didn't, because we just weren't even ready for something this massive. And going into it for season 2, I think the main reason that we really felt like it was important to retell was because we felt that there was so much of that story that was kind of unexplored from like a processing point of view, because the story became so taboo. It became the thing you just can't even talk about, and people in the industry feel like they can't talk about, and it just didn't feel like there weren't any constructive conversations happening around it. When I think there are a lot of things, some positives and things that like, you know, we can learn from this and also empathize with as well, which I think was another thing we were seeing online that was geared towards some of the people that you're seeing in this show. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to try and put together the show really from an empathetic point of view, with getting all the people that this affected the most, or trying to get all of the people that this affected the most, and like kind of getting them together and having them just talk about their experience. And one thing we found in doing that is we really found that they wanted to share their story. Like, they had kind of kept this aside for so long, and there wasn't really that platform to really express their complex feelings on it, because it's all very complicated. It's a very complicated story. Like, I can't even imagine putting myself in those shoes of like knowing somebody who had committed that crime, thinking I knew somebody, you know, well enough, and then seeing what happened, you know, and trying to process that and come to terms with that, especially if that was your friend, if that was your brother-in-law, or if that was your father in some cases. And so that to us we found that this was something that people wanted to finally talk about, and kind of be closing the book on it a little way, but also having like an effective catharsis afterwards. And so in doing that, it was like we could only tell it if it was from that point of view, rather than kind of digging up old wounds just for sensational purposes, you know. And I think that we achieved that with the episode.
Talking with Evan Husney, the executive producer and writer for Dark Side of the Ring. Catch it on Vice TV. It's on every Tuesday night now, right? Starting this week, every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central on Vice TV. And you're right. One of the themes that it seemed to carry was how the living victims of what Chris did, how it affected them, and in particular, David Benoit, Chris's older son, as well as Nancy's sister, Sandra. Real quick, the rest of season 2, you've got everything from the death of Owen Hart to New Jack from ECW to the Road Warriors, which, in my mind, the greatest tag team of all. Without letting anything out of the bag, give us a little, like a nugget of something to get excited about, besides the simple fact these are just fantastic stories told by some fantastic people. Give us a little something to watch for as season 2 continues. Yeah,
I'll give you one quick, big one, and then one quick for the fans. Actually, maybe two. The Owen Hart episode, I think, is going to be the one that is going to be the most fascinating outside of the Benoit episode, of course, is really because, this is a perspective on the story that I don't think anyone's really gotten in depth, especially on camera. And the fact that, Martha Hart and her children basically came together to want to tell this story, and then getting their whole perspective on it is definitely one of the things you want to look for, because that is just really, really emotional, really moving. And I think to the fans, obviously there are some stories, some names that you're familiar with that are in season 2, but I don't think, because I certainly wasn't, and I consider myself to know a thing or two about wrestling, but I really didn't know much about the UWF and Herb Abrams, which was an ill-fated wrestling company started by a wrestling fan in the late 80s, early 90s that turned out to be a spectacular disaster. And this episode, day by day, because we're just putting the finishing touches on it, is really shaping up to be fascinating. So for those that like the Gino Hernandez episode, one that's kind of more, a deeper cut, shall we say, this Herb Abrams episode is definitely going to be that for season 2.
Excited for all of it. He is Evan Husney. He is the executive producer and the writer for Dark Side of the Ring. Catch it Tuesday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central on Vice TV. Follow him on Twitter at Evan Husney. And you can follow the show on Twitter at Dark Side of Ring. Evan, thank you so much for your time. All the best to you. Looking forward to the rest of season 2.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.